When Roman Abramovich sold Chelsea back in 2022, all the money was meant to go to victims of the Ukraine war.
So that's a huge £2.5 billion that, according to one of our guests on the pod today, would change the face of global humanitarian aid.
3 years later, the money is still sitting frozen in a Barclays bank account, all because of a loophole. And now the UK government is threatening to sue Abramovich.
Now, the former Chelsea owner very rarely speaks publicly, but has broken his silence for a new book. And we're joined today by the author of that book to hear the story behind the sale, his attempt at poisoning, and also what his relationship is like with Vladimir Putin.
And later in the show, most athletes are used to competing for a couple of hours, some for only 10 seconds. But what's it like to do it for 24 hours, driving in the dark on public roads at speeds of up to 200 miles an hour?
Well, one of the world's most decorated female drivers, Jamie Chadwick, kept her promise of coming back on the pod to tell us all about Le Mans.
Welcome to the Sports Agents. Hello, Mark.
Hi, Gabby. How are you?
Very well indeed. It feels like it's been a while because, of course, we had our Parkhouse Stables special on Tuesday, which we'd pre-recorded. And so much, it feels like has happened, actually, since the last time we spoke in what is supposed to be the quiet time in the world of sport. I would like your take on the Club World Cup, though, if you have managed to see any of it at all.
Do you know, I haven't really. I haven't watched any game from start to finish. I was working on Monday night, so in the studio, I had a monitor on of Chelsea against LAFC, which I do wonder was maybe the right game to have on, in the sense of you got a real glimpse into how awkward a lot of this tournament is. Firstly, the crowd was terrible. 20 odd thousand, but for a Monday 3 o'clock in the afternoon kickoff. And the only thing that I would say about that was that stadium in Atlanta is one of the hotbeds of soccer, of MLS. Their club is really well supported. And I can remember doing a Super Bowl in Atlanta and walking through some neighborhoods in Atlanta, and they had the Atlanta football strips in their windows, not the Atlanta Falcons Super Bowl strips, but the football team strips. So it is a hotbed of football out there. So the crowd was really, really disappointing. But then I just found everything about the build-up really awkward and uncomfortable. The players coming out individually to be announced. I mean, I think the first Chelsea player out, or certainly the one I watched coming out, was Mark Cucurella, who couldn't have looked more confused about what on earth was going on, why he hadn't got his teammates behind him, where he was meant to stand. It went on for ages. Every player on both sides introduced individually. It was just so uncomfortable.
It's a real example of you have to watch something because you're either invested in it because you've got a team in the race, or because you care about the whole thing. And actually, my overwhelming emotion has been I don't really care. I don't.
No. No, I don't. And I don't know whether it may be because you have to sort of hold your hands up a bit here and go, because we work in it, by the time you get to June, we're lucky enough to have watched a lot of football. So I quite like getting to June and just immersing myself in Test cricket or some of the tennis that's going on, or the golf, or whatever it may be. And therefore, I just wonder whether, because of what we do, sometimes you just think, I just need a break from football. But I think the majority of people are again, unless you're Chelsea or Manchester City fans, a little bit domestically, why would you care? I mean, I saw today that Red Bull Salzburg are in it. And then I'm thinking, how the hell did Red Bull Salzburg qualify for this club?
Well, this ties
World
in.
Cup?
Chelsea qualify from their endeavours of 2022, which actually ties in nicely with the rest of our pod today, actually. And so then I'm thinking, well, 2029 is the next Club World Cup. So where does that leave? Is it next year that the team should be thinking about?
I think it may, yeah.
And then it feels so kind of disjointed, doesn't it?
And we always say, don't we? We always say on this pod, things need to be simple for people to understand, and this feels really complicated about how you even get into this thing.
It's getting bigger, by the way.
And it is going to get bigger. I suppose if we were being fair, because some people might go, well, the other thing you also say on the pod is it's going to take time for people to care about something.
Yeah.
Like when we do, I mean, there's another episode to be done on the Michael Johnson Grand Slam track, isn't there, going forward? But
that's also happened since we were last on. That they've announced the LA leg has been basically kiboshed.
So but we keep saying, sometimes if you're launching something new, it's going to take ages for the history to build up for people to care about. So maybe we have to be, if we're going to be balanced, you have to be fair about that on this
Or
this
you
side of
hold
things
it
as
somewhere
well.
where you can almost guarantee that you're going to get plenty of,
Well,
enthusiastic crowds. Although having said that, it was interesting watching the under-21s playing against Germany last night. I dipped into that for a little bit. England playing there in the European Championships, and they have qualified. They're out of the group. They're going to play Spain at the weekend. It's knockout football all the way now for them. But I was quite surprised at how few people there were there, actually. The pockets of the ground were really busy. And when I'm thinking about going to watch, say, even the under-26 nations rugby, when England play, I mean, they had 25,000 in France at the end of last season's Six Nations. And, and they always absolutely sell out those crowds. So I just wonder sometimes if these tournaments aren't going to hotbeds and not thinking about, that element of it. Is it just kind of taking it around the world for the sake of taking it around the world?
Well, a bit. But then also there doesn't feel like there's too much rugby union.
Good point.
When the Six Nations and the under-26 nations, then the Women's Six Nations is going on, all eyeballs. I know there's some other stuff going on, but all the eyeballs are on that, aren't there?
Yeah,
Whereas
it's a condensed period of time.
Yeah, there is never any break.
It's the old
from
NFL
anything.
Analogy, isn't it?
They're always,
Keep it tight, keep it rare, keep it like something that people are going to look forward to and then lament it's gone afterwards.
Yeah.
Instead of this continuum where it just never seems to drop off.
And in the middle of which of that continuum is going to be the women's Euros as well, which is yet more football, and also is the feeling of yet more football because FIFA have decided to
throw in the Club World Cup.
Throw in the Club World Cup to complicate the summer even more.
On that, a very creative way of announcing the Wales team earlier today, Rhiannon Wilkinson announced her squad. And they did it at the top of Snowdon, which is a very creative way of doing it. And they had to get cameras up the night before. And luckily for them, the weather was gorgeous because you could be scuppered quite quickly with the weather up there. And it looked rather magnificent, actually. They've chosen a perfect week to do it. One of the big kind of news lines out of that, Sophie Ingle, released by Chelsea at the end of the season player who did her ACL in a pre-season game last season, hasn't played any competitive football, included in the squad. Huge experience, 144 caps. One of those kind of, Jess Fishlock is there, but one of those players like that you would hope in her lifetime would play in a major tournament. And I hope she still gets to play in the tournament, and she hasn't just been brought in to kind of cheerlead and give experience, because
always a risk though, isn't it?
It is a risk.
Always a risk when you pick a player particularly coming off a long-term injury who hasn't featured at all,
and especially their group. There's not an easy game there.
Yeah,
their opening game is against Netherlands, and then they've got the small matter of England and France, and that's that is one tough group to try and enforce your kind of Welsh personality on this tournament. And there will be an element of that. I think there'll be an element of the crowd. The Welsh fans have bought out all the tickets they can. They will be a force, but have they got what it takes to make a dent in the performances of those teams?
And it's not like they don't have experience within that squad, is it? It's not like they needed to bring her in because they were short of people with 100+ caps. I mean, they've got a few with a lot of experience in that squad.
Yeah, none of them, of course, have ever been to a major tournament there, and that's where I guess you're going to find out a lot about yourself, aren't you, in that environment. And obviously we wish them all the very, very best. A lot of players coming from playing in the States as well, so they're not even playing together in the WSL. They've got to get used to each other, but it's going to be so exciting for them. And we think back to 2016 and Wales men in that European Championships, and miracles do happen.
And also, we ought to say thank you very much for all the feedback to our episode that we mentioned right at the top when we were at Parkhouse Stables. You can listen back to that. Obviously on the feed. You can also watch the episode on YouTube as well. David Hagger sends a message saying we should now go and cover horseball, which is like basketball on horseback.
Maybe he saw you on the Exerciser and thought that man needs another horse challenge. I've never heard of it.
Is that real? I've never heard of that.
But why not? I mean, there's a thing called horse gymnastics, which my nieces in Scotland did until they were at 16, which is literally like doing gymnastics on a moving horse. and it is like doing so effectively you're training for the circus. I mean, it's incredible watching it.
Really?
Yeah. And there's two companies that train actors for stunts on horses based not far from where I live, actually, in the home counties.
Oh.
And they like throw themselves around the barrel of a horse, the base of the horse, and it's quite incredible. So you can do anything.
I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that. But if you did
I don't
that,
think we get the
then
insurance.
Lee Mack would have massive more respect for you than just the ribbon thing that he always puts you away for.
Well, I think maybe that ship sailed for me, but we'll have a look into it. And yeah, you can catch up with all episodes, of course, of The Sports Agents on Global Player or wherever you get your podcasts. Hit subscribe or follow, and don't forget to rate and review.
So next up, will Ukraine ever receive the money from the sale of Chelsea Football Club? We're going to speak to two people at the heart of the issue. Nick Purewall, who wrote the book on this story and has spoken to Abramovich himself in a very rare interview, and also Mike Penrose, the former executive director of Unicef UK, who'll be heading up the foundation that will eventually give out that money. Well, thank you both for joining us. I wonder whether it's worth, Nick, just doing the background on why he was forced to sell Chelsea and how they made him sell Chelsea before we get into the actual sale and subsequently what is happening with the funds.
Absolutely. So really, you can trace it back to 2018 and the Skripal affair and the poisoning, because the UK attitude to Russia turned on its head overnight, expelling a record number, I think it was 153 Russian diplomats. Then Russia responded in kind. And Abramovich told me that after that time, the attitudes towards him completely changed. From he was waiting for what should have been a routine visa renewal, and he'd had Home Office staff visiting his home, suggesting, actually, you really should have an investor visa, and saying, don't worry, we'll fill out all the forms, please, sort of falling over themselves for him to do this. And he said, no, I don't want an investor visa. I just have my, stick with what I've got. So he was expecting what should have been a formality of a renewal, but after Skripal, he didn't hear and didn't hear and didn't hear, and he and his people decided they would just withdraw gracefully. And he didn't come to London for something like 2.5 years. And when he did come, he was eventually told he had a meeting with someone from the UK government, from the Home Office in Istanbul, when he was told he would be okay to travel to London. So then he came to London on his Israeli passport and visited one of his London homes for the first time in more than 2 years, where he felt like a stranger in his own home. He said it was like going into a house where somebody had died, because people who have sort of assets all around the world, if they're not using them regularly, then they would have staff who sort of prepare them for their arrival. But I think it perhaps hadn't been prepared, so it kind of felt like it had been left empty and it didn't feel like his home. And London didn't feel like his city. He pulled at the last minute Chelsea's new stadium plan. He was going to spend more than £1 billion of his own money to rebuild Stamford Bridge and turn it into an icon for London. That would have been jobs.
That was because of the economic climate that he felt wasn't conducive.
That was because of the political climate. Yeah, he felt like he wasn't welcome in London anymore.
So it was much more to do with that than the line that came out that it was to do with the economy then.
So he felt as though they had looked around. His people had done due diligence on investment, and they put together this package of potential investment from China. And at the 11th hour, he said, well, why would we do that when I can just pay for it myself? So an awful lot of work had gone into, and I think that was quite common. I think he wanted to stress test situations, right. And then would always, because Chelsea, as he explained it to me, was a labour of love for him. So that's what he wanted to do, was invest, and he wanted to leave, I suppose, his legacy, but something that would change probably the borough, forever and for the better. But when he felt like he was persona non grata and he wasn't welcome in London or the UK, he decided, well, why would I do that? And so then obviously in the years following, it was clear, or it was sort of made clear to people around him, that the government were trying to find reasons to sanction him and couldn't find any reasons to sanction him. And then as soon as Russia invaded Ukraine, the bar for sanctions was markedly lowered. So at that point, he knew or expected or feared that sanctions would come, sort of hoped that they wouldn't. So I suppose in hoping for the best but planning for the worst, he then made a snap decision to put Chelsea up for sale. So on the day that the war broke out, on the day that the war broke out, 12 hours after the war started, he flew to Poland for talks with Ukrainian government because they asked him to help if he could sort of facilitate.
He was at this point trying to broker a peace deal.
That's right. But then on the 2nd of March, the day that Chelsea played at Luton in the FA Cup, he'd been in meetings and I think he saw the wind of change, and he picked up the phone to a couple of his aides to say, draft a statement to say that Chelsea is unequivocally for sale in full, and I want all of the proceeds to be donated to all victims of the Ukraine war.
So he preempted it rather than forced it, than being forced.
That's right, and he was forced eventually because obviously sanctions did come, and at that point, Chelsea was forced to be sold as a distressed asset. So it's the first major sports franchise in history to be sold as a distressed asset.
And there was talk at the time, and you discussed this in your book, about how close, because obviously there were those in the media who quite liked to push the story that Chelsea was about to fold. And you talk about the emotions inside the club where people thought that their livelihoods, their jobs, their careers there were in jeopardy. Yeah. And the club was going under.
That's right. And on the day that the club was sanctioned, people were in tears and scared and upset and shocked. And even on the day that Roman Abramovich issued the statement to say that the club was for sale, the people closest to him were shocked and surprised by it. Bruce Buck was sort of moved to tears. Marina Granovskaya was at home ill with COVID, actually, and had to read the statement twice as it had come through on email because she thought in her fever, she was like, that's a fever dream. And then realised it was real and was like, oh, okay, that's actually happening. And it had been talked about, but I think what is quite typical of him, from all the people who are close to him and have been with him for a long time, say that once he makes a decision, it's very quick, but it's totally decisive and action happens straight away.
Why did he let you in to get so close and conduct these interviews?
There's, on one level, the honest answer on one level is probably by sort of doing nothing. So over time I got close to people who work for him and are really close to him, some of the people who work in his family office. I was covering Chelsea. I was the Chelsea correspondent for the Press Association, and they started what would become the award-winning Say No to Anti-Semitism campaign, which was unprecedented in football. It was clear from the outset it was a passion project of the owner, and he put an awful lot of his own money behind it. And I've got mixed race heritage. My dad's Indian, my mum was English, so I've always seen things from two perspectives anyway. I do think that's part of why I'm a journalist, funnily, but also so I had sort of a personal connection to wanting to try to do something that might be able to affect a positive change and help in a small way by just reporting what they were doing. I felt passionately about that. I must have shown that at events where people close to him were there because, of how heavily he valued it. I did think the things they were doing were remarkable. I reported on that as such. And there were times when I did have to, almost kind of kick the door in and fight for it being important because it wasn't a straight sports story. Mm-hmm. So I had people saying, why is this a story? And I was saying, why is it not a story? In many ways, it's more important than what happens on the pitch on a Saturday. If it's unprecedented and on the level we're talking about, they were sponsoring to send people with football banning orders to the march to Auschwitz as an educational tool to combat racism.
This all while he was still owning the club.
That's right. Yes. So this is in the years This is in the years before. Yes. So this would have been this had been sort of 2018, 2019 onwards.
What's clear as well, if anybody does any kind of research into Abramovich, is that he absolutely loved the club. And while he was in the country, any time he could, he wasn't an absent owner. He was supporting. He was in the dressing room. He knew the players personally. He had their numbers on the phone. He was totally invested emotionally in Chelsea.
That's right. And I mean, there's a chapter in the book, The Roman Empire, about his take for the first time ever on why he bought Chelsea, what precipitated that. And there's this amazing story about how he was basically, I think, 36 and ready to retire. But someone like that, I don't think ever retires. So, it's, he was thinking, what's my next project? Is it something that could be community-based? Is it something that could be, potentially humanitarian? Is it philanthropy? What am I going to do with an awful lot of time if I step back from frontline business? And friends of his kept saying, look, you're not that much into football, but you understand the game. And really, if you get into it, you'll absolutely love it. And if you buy a club, you will love it. And he sort of, put off for a while, and then they twisted his arm to go to Manchester United against Real Madrid, April 2003, the second quarter-final, where Ronaldo, Nazario had an unbelievable game, and Beckham came off the bench and scored a goal, and I think United won the match, didn't they? But they lost. They didn't go through. Madrid went through anyway. But so they flew on Abramovich's plane, and they got to Manchester Airport, and Graham Souness gave them a lift. And Abramovich didn't recognise him, but he said to, I think, Pinny Zahavi, he said, he's quite well dressed for a driver, isn't he? And he said that this is the Blackburn Rovers manager. He said, "Oh, Graham Souness, yes." And then, so sort of, embarrassment averted. But then they got to the ground and parked the car, and they walked from the car to the stadium. And Abramovich was telling me how, for the first time, he completely understood the whole thing, the energy of the crowd, everyone walking together to the sort of, one common destination. And I think genuinely when he was talking about it, you could kind of see in his whole body language, his eyes lit up. And he was genuinely talking like any football fan. Every football fan, if you have a team that you support and you go every week, you never deviate from your walk, do you, to the ground? Wherever you park, however you get there, whether you get the train, the bus, park the car, or you shut your door and walk around the corner, you take the same walk, don't you? You see the same people, you get that same sense of anticipation and excitement. And for the first time, he'd had that. And then basically that was it. He was like, right, and he loved the match, and he was like, right, we're buying a football club. And the next day, the mission started to buy a football club.
Where did you? How many interviews did you do with him for this?
Two. Yeah.
Two. Where? In what kind of environment did you interview him?
Yeah.
And did you come away from that thinking, I could go for a beer with you?
Yes. Yeah.
Or vodka.
Sorry. Yeah. Well.
Does he drink?
I don't know. Is
he? Did you get a sense of any of his lifestyle? Kind of, how he operates as a man.
Yeah, he's very, very family orientated, very, very, and very, very loyal. And I think everyone who's worked for him for the longest time says he's an amazing boss because he will put you on the spot to say, "What do you think? Don't give me the context or the whole picture. Tell me what you think we should do." And he'd make people be blunt with him. And kind of say, talk to me like you're talking to, one of your colleagues, like I'm not in the room, please. And then he'd say, okay, great, that's what we do. And he'd never second guess it. And he'd say, doesn't matter what happens next, doesn't matter if it goes wrong, it won't be your fault. We do it and there's no blame. So it was a remarkable culture that they built. And also,
but you had two interviews.
Yes, and so I went to see him. I spent a day with him, about five hours probably. The interview itself in Istanbul. In a house of one of his friends, and it was sort of this remarkable, beautiful, immaculate house where you come down the stairs to a really big open plan sort of dining table, sitting room with a table looking out on bifold doors that would pull back to a jetty and then the Bosphorus. So he sat there talking about,
did you think I'll be in there if this doesn't go well?
Well, I sat there thinking, the first thing was he disabused any worry because he stood up, came over, shook my hand really firmly, tapped me on the shoulder and said, pleased to meet you, thank you for coming. My name's Roman, ask me anything. And it was genuinely, and he meant it. And
in English?
Yeah. And he spoke in Russian for the interview with translation from one of his trusted advisors. But he didn't need my questions translating. And I think his English is probably perfect, I would imagine. It's certainly very, very good. And he's quite an introverted man. He's quite shy. But once he was comfortable, I think I asked 4 questions in about 5 hours. It was a study in getting out of his way and letting him, do his thing.
Mike, we haven't heard from you yet. I think we should bring Mike in, chappers, because obviously you're here to kind of disseminate the legal part of this whole story, if you like, because the terminology is very important, I think, in this, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Seized assets and sanctioned assets, or a sanctioned person. has very different ramifications.
Yeah, and to disseminate the legal stuff, I'm not a lawyer in any way. And it was really important that I haven't been privy to any of the legal proceedings around the sale of Chelsea.
But the government would like you eventually to be potentially in charge of...
It wasn't the government's choice. It was.
Right.
It's an interesting story being introduced. So the way I actually first got introduced to Roman's people was I used to be chairman of Soccer Aid when at the same time I was CEO of Unicef, and we, as you know, we did a Soccer Aid at Stamford Bridge, and a little while after that I just got contacted out the blue by some of the people in Chelsea and said, look, Roman would like to do some charity work. He's done plenty before. What would you advise? How would you set up a charity? And I was just stepping back from Unicef at the time. And I said, look, what's your budget? And they said, a few $100 million. And that was
Nice
already...
budget to start with.
It's exactly. and it was already... This was well before the sanctioning or well before the second iteration of the Ukraine war. And so I advised on how you would set up a foundation that could spend it properly with decent oversight within humanitarian principles and laws. I spent 28 years of my life as a humanitarian aid worker. And they were really interested in it. And then the Ukraine war broke out. And I got this phone call from the same people going, right, Mike, what would happen if 200 million was 2.34 billion? I said, that would probably be the largest humanitarian foundation in the world. And I said, it's also really important that you'll get every UN agency and NGO coming to you saying, give it to us. Mm-hmm. No individual organisation would be capable of managing that amount of money. It would be somewhere like half the budget of, say, UNICEF globally, but for a year. So I said the best way to do it is to get a really good board of people who know what they're talking about from a political perspective, from a humanitarian perspective, from a business management perspective, because you have to manage the money whilst you're spending it. But it should be a spend-out fund. It should be something that it's not a sort of in perpetuity thing. There's too much need in the world. Let's spend it out over 10 years. And it was set up, or the initial iteration, as sanctions were approaching, was that it was for the victims of conflict. Full stop. There was no geographic allocation of that. And we were quite well advanced in sort of developing this when the sanctioning happened. And when that happened, I just got a text message saying, we've been sanctioned. And I understand for the sale, and Nick's has had far more access to people around the sale of it, that written into the deed of undertaking was that it would go for a humanitarian foundation for the victims of conflict set up by me. After that, that's when government got involved with me, and they were saying, look, we need to make sure that the money's not going to be spent inappropriately. We have to sign a sanctions license to release it to the foundation. And so we went along, and all the documents were prepared. I brought together a board it's the best board I've ever seen of international organisations. There were senior political figures, a former Under-Secretary General of the UN, the head of one of the biggest foundations in the US. These are people of stature. Yeah. And they would have been the board, and we would have set up something that would have spent, we were estimating, about $350 million a year for 10 years to help victims of conflict worldwide. And then I was told by government, effectively, we, upon the sale of the club, they were, and this, again, I was not privy to this, but this is what I've been told, that they were contacted by the Portuguese and the EU and told that EU rules also applied to this, so it had to be spent according to EU rules. Now, from my understanding, a lot of those rules were set up for confiscated money that's been taken away from somebody forcibly and spent against a political agenda. This, when money's sanctioned, it is still the property of the person who's been sanctioned.
Yeah.
And in UK law, they can only freeze money and assets, so they can't seize. So there's no seizure.
No, exactly. And the sort of situation of the money, it was in an account from the company that owned Chelsea, and it's the same.
It's still there.
Barclays UK.
Earning decent interest.
Probably decent.
Yeah. I hear it's going up quite considerably day by day, and especially over the last few years, I think quite good interest. But it's still in there. But it's very, very similar to, if a bank suspects your credit card or your bank account has been a victim of fraud, they will put a lock around it. You cannot spend from it or anything happens. That's effectively what happens.
This is not Barclays doing this. This is Barclays obeying the law.
This is government choice, obeying a Department of Treasury called OFSI, Office for Sanctions Implementation, and they locked the money. But it's still owned by Roman.
But they've locked it. Why?
Because
he's sanctioned.
that's the law. So basically, when sanctions are imposed on an individual, they're called a designated person, and there'll be a written reason of designations as to why that person is sanctioned. So Roman Abramovich was sanctioned because the government, because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and then a very detailed set of allegations that Abramovich is close to Putin, can influence Putin, could influence Russia. So effectively,
so preventing that money
right.
potentially being used to furnish
Exactly.
the Russian side of
that's
that
right.
war.
And in order to put pressure on people of his standing, who the government believes could have an influence to change the course of the war, in order that, because obviously they would think that people don't want to be sanctioned, so they would then try to exert influence on Vladimir Putin to change his mind. It's really important to say that Roman Abramovich has always vehemently denied all of these allegations about being close to Putin, about any kind of association.
Did you ask him whether could he phone Putin?
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, and I think that what's clear to say is in his role in terms of trying to back channel, in terms of facilitate peace talks, all he did was pass messages between delegations. So he wasn't involved in any of the negotiations or anything like that. When the war broke out, the Ukrainian government contacted more than 40 people of standing influence, fame, all those sorts of things, high net worth individuals. Abramovich was the only person who agreed to help.
But
everyone else said no.
He did travel to Kiev, didn't he?
He's been in Kiev
and that's
a lot,
where he was poisoned.
That was it. So he, on the 2nd of March, he picked up the phone to his aides and said, draft a statement to say that Chelsea was for sale. Chelsea beat Luton that night in the FA Cup at Kenilworth Road. He flew from Turkey to Poland and then drove through the night from Poland to Kiev, because that's the only way to get in because of the war. And then he and two people he was with had dinner in an apartment that was set up for them. And the last thing he remembers is stepping into a separate room to take a phone call. And then he blacked out, but doesn't remember that. When he came to hours later, it was, he couldn't see. He was blind, and his hair was falling out, and his skin was peeling off his hands and his face. And the other people he was with had the same symptoms. So they were rushed to hospital across the
city in a war
zone. Yeah, and then they were treated there and told, we're pretty confident you've been poisoned, but you'll need further examination. And they were told, you can't leave because you still need emergency treatment. But he said, we've got meetings with the Ukrainians, so they went anyway. And so he was sat there in these meetings with his eyes just watering constantly, his sight not fully returned, being told by the doctors, what are you doing? And when they arrived at these meetings, they were told that the Ukrainian the member of the Ukrainian delegation, who was the envoy to the Russian delegation, who was delivering messages and meeting with them, speaking with them personally, he'd been shot dead in the street 2 days earlier on. So that was the point at which they thought this isn't a coincidence.
Why do you think, you said 40 people were contacted and he was the only one? Mm-hmm. Why do you think he felt that he should get involved to this degree?
Because everyone else is scared. Definitely, everyone else is scared, and the characterization people have of him, and I think I've seen, is that he's so sanguine about everything. He's so calm, wouldn't you say? He's a really calm man, isn't he? And he'll sort of, he has this really kind way about him, where he'll sort of smile, and he'd take it just with one sort of smile and a sort of little almost imperceptible movement, he could take a lot of pressure out of a room.
Do you think he recognised that those skills were needed? Because obviously that also, there is a sense of, I could be the person who could actually sort this out.
I think so.
So is there an element of him that, I'm not saying like a God complex, but is there an element to him that everybody has an ego, right? Is there a bit of him that would be, actually, I could go in there and I could sort this out? That would elevate me beyond somebody who's just a rich bloke who owns a football club.
I think he takes an awful lot of responsibility for an awful lot of things, and I think generally as a society, we don't understand wealth. We don't understand wealthy people, and we don't understand what they do or how they operate. And we were talking about this before, weren't we? But I think a high net worth individual like that is one person who runs a multinational operation on their own with a skeleton staff. and it's normally people they've come up with their whole life.
Mm-hmm.
And Roman Abramovich was born into nothing.
Yeah.
Both of his parents died. He was orphaned by the time he was 4, and he was raised by his grandparents. And this is a man who at one point was selling rubber ducks in Red Square, and then became and went from that through business to becoming one of the richest men in the world.
And this was the impression I got very much when I was told his story. I've only met him twice as well, just for around some of the process here, but it's that sort of sanguine calmness about him. And then when someone said he grew up as an orphan in the Soviet Union with nothing to become wealthy, I think that some of his advisors before, when the money was sanctioned, etc., he says he doesn't look back. That's gone, that's gone.
Yes.
He just looks forward.
Yeah.
So what next? What next?
Absolutely.
And to that point, and your point on the God complex and things like this, that's why I'll reiterate. They came to me before the sanctioning, before it was anything, saying several hundred million, and he's already done that before. He just wants to do it well.
Well, I was going to ask about the money, because obviously it's sitting there doing nothing at the moment. What were your plans? What could it be doing? How much good could it be doing?
I mean, if you look at the state of the world today, as I said, I was a humanitarian aid worker for 28 years. I worked on the front line. I specialised in conflict for about 18 to 20 years. So ironically, on my second ever mission, I was kidnapped in Russia by fighters during the Chechen War. I have never known the humanitarian system as underfunded and as overwhelmed as it is today. So we hear a lot about Ukraine and we're hearing a lot about Gaza. But if you look at Sudan, at the moment, it's catastrophic. I mean, it's biblical. Famine, war, it's absolutely awful. We have ongoing crises in places like Yemen. We're potentially looking down the barrel of another Middle Eastern war on top of that, or potentially even it started. There is, and at the same time, USAID, the US government donor agency, has been decimated. They don't give any more, and they were the world's biggest donors. What used to be DFID has now been absorbed into the Foreign Office, and it was 0.7% of our GNI. Then it became 0.5, and now it's 0.3. That's billions and billions outside the system, and we've never had as much need. So this could save the lives of millions and millions and millions of children. And this is really where I get a bit angry, because it's a political block to this. The arguments that are being used, and I'm not a lawyer, I haven't seen the documents, but the arguments that are being given to me is we need it to be spent to you, the foundation. If we release it to you, we need it to be spent in this way. Firstly, that undermines all humanitarian principles, which are neutrality, impartiality and independence. If it was spent in the way they were talking, if a child was travelling from to become a refugee, when they got to Lviv, we could help them under what the government was proposing. But as soon as they crossed into Poland, we'd have to not help them, because the government's saying it can only be spent inside Ukraine. And this is humanitarian money. I could help, they're underfunded on families that have generously taken in Ukrainian refugees in the UK. We're underfunded in the UK on that, which is resulting in some of the political issues you see. Couldn't help them either. And 2.34 billion sounds like a lot. It could be blown on the reconstruction of 4 bridges, or it could help hundreds of millions of children over the lifespan of this. And all I'm ever told is, legally there's a block.
Is it? So who is it, Mike? Who tells you when you say government?
Yeah.
And this will have gone on over both Tory and Labour governments.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So is this I don't know, David Lammy now? Was it Boris Johnson was Foreign Secretary, wasn't he?
That was before before this. But
it was Liz Truss when Obama
Is it Foreign Secretaries who are saying this to you? And you are basically saying, I suppose, that the British government, whatever political persuasion they are determining who the good guy in a conflict is and who the bad guy in a conflict is, even though it is civilians on all sides who suffer.
Actually, there's civilians on all sides. Absolutely. And you've hit the nail on the head there on humanitarian principles. Humanitarian principles founded by the Geneva Conventions and the ICRC are that a victim is a victim as long as they're a civilian. A victim's a victim. But also an argument they're using a lot is you can't spend it in Russia or Belarus. And we wouldn't. Because firstly, and it was some of the most insane arguments, and they still come out in the press, is we need to make sure it's not going back to these places. I would be breaking the law if I did this. There's a Russia and Belarus Sanctions Act. I cannot send money to Russia and Belarus. So they're effectively saying, well, we can't let you do this in case you break the law.
So does it need to go to court, this?
I don't know, because it's a political decision. The argument being used for not releasing it is that shortly before the sale of the club, the UK agreed, the EU apparently, and again this is what I've been told, contacted them and said, we have, because of its Portuguese citizenship, we have jurisdiction over this. And they went, okay, yes you do. Now, I'm no fan of Brexit. I'm not a Brexiteer. I was against it. But we had left the EU by then. And there's been negotiations since on the status of Northern Ireland and others where the British government has stood up and says we do not recognise the EU's position on this. But they're not doing it in this regard.
And I've interviewed several, in the course of the book, I interviewed several of the UK's foremost sanctions experts, some of the top lawyers in the country, who all said there's no reason for the government to concern themselves with the EU law in this case. They didn't need to do that.
And within this, the structure that we've set up, so it's ready to go. We just have to apply to the Charity Commission for sort of registration. And we set it up in consultation with the Charity Commission to make sure that it had all the right statutes and everything in place. The argument is only about where that money will be spent and the government wanting to dictate that.
But bearing in mind your experience, and bearing in mind the board that you have put together, and you've gone through that and their expertise, surely it would be very easy to follow a trail of everything that you are doing with that money.
No, entirely. In
Wouldn't
fact, we offered government an observer status on the board with the right of veto to veto any decision by the board that would contradict sanctions legislation. That's in the documents. They can take that up. So that's all there. And this is where I said there might be legal arguments based on what they've signed. But I've seen the government, when it comes to other aspects of Brexit, confront that. And I think, particularly given that we have a growing closeness with the EU, my personal opinion, if Keir Starmer were to go to the EU now and say, let this drop, it's a humanitarian foundation. And you're saying that the people on the board, the Under-Secretary General of the UN was the Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs. And I was the CEO of Unicef, I was the CEO of Action contre la Faim, I spent 28 years as an aid worker. Sometimes them saying we need to make sure it will be well spent, and we've said you've got a veto position on the board, that's where I sit there going,
this must be, Rema must feel incredibly frustrated.
I spent the best part of 2 years. I covered the whole sale process at the time, and I spent the best part of 2 years researching and writing this book and interviewing people and writing this book, and I've interviewed more than 50 people for this book, and I cannot get to the bottom of the detail of exactly why. None of the big beasts in government at the time gave any credence to the idea of me interviewing them. They all approached all their people repeatedly and entirely stonewalled by all of them. Told them exactly what I was going to do, what I was going to say, the ways in which it, let's be blunt, was going to make them look like they had made mistakes, because they have made mistakes, and they refuse to engage because they don't want to have anything to do with this, because it is just another symptom of an absolutely failing government at that time. The state of UK politics, and this isn't party political, that group of politicians left so much to be desired, not just for this, but for so many different people across so many different walks of life. And we're still picking up the pieces, and our political class have got to pull their socks up.
Before you go, Chappers, I think an opportunity, because today, of course, the announcement that the LA Lakers is going to be sold for $10 billion, which is the most expensive sale of any US sports franchise in history. And there is a Chelsea link here.
Absolutely. Todd Boehly, one of his partners, Mark Walter, is the man who fronts the new ownership of the Lakers. And so Todd has an ownership stake in the Lakers and the Dodgers. And I met with Todd for this. I'm sort of the first UK journalist to sit down with him and talk really in depth about his time, and so the reasons why he was successful, why his bid was successful, and sort of what's coming next. And within that time, it was very clear that across the course of his time with the Dodgers, he'd seen really how a sports team could transform a city, and they've won 2 titles, but the first one was in COVID, and the second time when they won, he was at the parade, saying, I was there were 300,000 people there, and it felt transformational, and really that's the success we want to bring to Chelsea, and it's kind of the success that obviously now they'll look to bring to the Dodgers. But I think where Todd and Mark Walter have a real commonality is in family, and certainly at the Dodgers they would both have had lots of people say that when they're there in their offices and things, they would have their families with them and encourage the players and the staff to do the same. So I think there's a real open culture and inclusive, and they're working very hard. But I think they want to make sure that they understand that for people, it's very, very hard to balance work and family life, isn't it? So I think they've got a really open way of going about things.
Has Todd Bowley been surprised at what it takes to run and own a football club?
I mean, I think so. I think firstly, what you have to say in their defence is that they wanted to have Bruce Buck and Marina Granovskaya stay for a transition of power. But at the 11th hour in the deal, it was made clear to them in no uncertain terms by the powers that be that just merely the removal of Roman Abramovich wouldn't be enough. So they had to clean house completely. And that's the reason why...
When you say powers that be, is that back to the government?
Yeah, of course, yeah. So, and that's the reason why Todd stepped in as sporting director, because they had already identified the people they wanted to be the sporting directors, but they were under gardening leave. So they would... they were hoping that they could have this transition of power. The first phone call that Todd got in charge of Chelsea was from Romelu Lukaku's people saying he will not return to Chelsea under any circumstances. So there's a bit of a baptism of fire. So I think that was the point in which Todd thought, okay, this is maybe, this might be harder than we thought. But I think the other thing to say is that Marina Granovskaya and Bruce Buck, along with Rainbank, were instrumental in choosing who would win. This most open most public of sports team sales of all time. And so they saw in Todd Bowley and Badad Eghbali a real commonality with Roman Abramovich, and his tenure and his people are just a real kind of drive to succeed. And also just really sort of being able to being agile, being quick with decisions, and being very clear about what they wanted to do. And clearly they've had to, because of that massive overhaul that they weren't expecting, they've had to take a lot of backward steps before going forward. But the scale and the pace of the investment, I think it's fair to say that Chelsea fans can hold to that. It hasn't gone well, it hasn't gone as well as they would have wanted. But they, as Todd said, they are in it for the long run.
They could win the Club World Cup, couldn't they?
They could win the Club World Cup, but it's been a better season, and I think there's an awful lot of young talent in there. They do need to put a bit of extra shape on it, don't they? But I think they're moving in the right direction finally.
Well, it seems like there's probably going to be another book in that one in the next few years. But this book sanctioned the inside story of the sale of Chelsea FC. Nick's book is out right now, and thank you very much, Mike, as well, for coming in.
Thank
you. It's very frustrating to just even hear what you're dealing with.
It is. It really.
I hope
it really
somehow it can get resolved.
What we're
people
dealing
who
with,
can benefit from that money.
It's what we're dealing with, but it's what this money could do. And that, to me, the final message, and all I've said is I'm neutral in this. But what I want is that this money goes to the people who need it the most. And I think the phrase that we've used before on getting it out is it's like fighting the blob. And this is the blob defined in terms of why we haven't got this money yet.
Well, best of luck.
Thank
we
you.
promised we'd check back in, didn't we, with Jamie Chadwick after she took on 24 hours of Le Mans, and she's up next.
How was it then, Jamie? How exhausting was it?
I think it would have been a lot more exhausting if we made it to the finish. Unfortunately, our car retired 13 hours in, which felt like a long way in, but still obviously over 10 hours to go at the time we finished. So we had a wheel unfortunately come off the car after a pit stop, which was a bit of a bad luck moment. We're looking reasonably competitive at that point. So pretty gutting to go out at that point.
Yeah, and presumably once something like that happens, it's not like F1 where you're used to changing tyres. This is a pretty insurmountable problem in Le Mans.
It was. The rear wheel came off, which ended up doing all sorts of other damage to the car. But also, it's one of those things that I don't know if it's a blessing in a way that we ended up fully retiring, because you could have gone a few laps down, got the car back, put the wheel back on, and then you're sort of continuing, you're trying to get to the end, but you're not fighting for anything. And in the sense that you obviously want to finish the race, and that would have been nice. But for the mechanics, everyone involved, it would have been a pretty exhausting end to the race.
So are you quite sanguine about it? It's just one of those things, and it happens sometimes in sport?
I think in reflection, yes. I think you kind of reflect on it and you think that, it's a big feat to finish Le Mans. I think had we finished, had we got a result in our first weekend doing it, would have been obviously incredible, but it's more likely not to go well than it is to go well. So I think we reflect on it well. But at the same time, I think we're fighting for the podium. So in the moment, it was pretty tough. Obviously, incredibly disappointing. You're lacking sleep as it is at that moment. So
Yeah.
yeah, it
The
wasn't
emotions are
the best
pretty
feeling.
raw, I imagine. Has it given you a taste, though? You've never really done much driving at night before, had you? And there's lots of things that you will have learned. Do you want to go back, do it again?
100%. It's that, yeah. Well, during it, it was funny because I mean, I got woken up in the middle of the night after about half an hour's of sleep, and I thought, I'm really questioning why I'm doing this at the moment. And then I was driving home, and yeah, you have that exact feeling of, yeah, you want to come back. You obviously don't want to be defeated by it. It feels like such an accomplishment to finish the race, ultimately to get a result. And also, you see the emotion of everyone involved. Everyone puts their heart and soul into it. So, yeah, now I've got the bug for sure.
Were you expecting to only have half an hour's sleep, or were you expecting more? I mean, how does that kind of thing work?
Uh, I don't really know what I was expecting. I think some drivers get more, some drivers get less, but the maximum you can get at a time is really about an hour. So depends how well or good you are at switching off, going to
Oh,
sleep, and then waking up, and also how much time you need or want to wake up. Some people just wake up straight before they get in the car, and that
Go.
in itself wakes them up. I wasn't fully confident in
I
myself
know
of doing that.
you were going to take your own coffee machine, weren't you? But I understand that five-time winner Oliver Gavin used acupuncture in his face to calm himself down. So maybe there was too much caffeine going on there. Getting that balance right must be something.
Definitely. It was interesting because, yeah, I didn't really know how to manage it. Caffeine wise, obviously, you can take on board a lot of carbohydrate, a lot of sugars. You know how cyclists and runners and things have gels. I was sort of trying not to consume too much of that because I was sort of saving it for towards the end of the race. But you also you can't predict what you're going to do. I thought I was going in at the beginning of the race for what we call a double stint. So that would have been maybe an hour and a half or so. And I ended up staying in for a quadruple stint. So you end up staying in the car for 3 hours. And I hadn't fueled properly, I hadn't planned properly, but you just have to make do, which is kind of part of the beauty of the race, I guess.
that was the same for me, Jamie. Coming back from Capital Summertime Ball on Sunday evening, I was needing honestly, it was really late. I needed coffees and all sorts of snacks on the way home. Did you? I mean, do you
Well, you and
rotor
you and
everything?
Muck busted. I mean, there's no separating you, is there? So it's a sacrifice.
Honestly, so I was actually by the stage for Will Smith. It was unbelievable. Anyhow, back to other things. Do you? I mean, do you? Is everything quite heavily rotated for you when you're doing this, or can you be sort of flexible and adapt to how you're feeling in the moment, whether it's going well for one of you? Is there that flexibility?
Great question. And it was, yeah, I thought it would be heavily rotated. I kind of got the plan out at the beginning of the race and I thought, okay, cool, I can really work around this. I know exactly when I'm going to be in the car and it does change. Obviously, anything can happen in the race, different safety cars, stoppages, anything that means that you kind of divert off the plan. So we were already diverting a bit off the plan, but it's a shame because our team are doing an awesome job. We went from 14th. When we went out of the race, I think we were second or third. So yeah, it was a shame. They were doing a really good job on the strategy, and I think we're going to continue to kind of push on that direction, and didn't quite happen, unfortunately.
Did you feel you'd done a lot of physical training, obviously outside of the car for a long time? We've talked about your weights and trail running and cycling. Did you feel physically that you'd done the right kind of out of car preparation?
I think so. I definitely felt like adrenaline took over, which was great. Like you get out the car and you feel a little bit sore. You wake up, and even if you've just had half an hour's sleep, you still feel a little bit like you've been in some sort of boxing fight at some point. But I definitely felt well prepared, and I think that's a good thing going forward. I know now a little bit more what it takes. Obviously, we didn't make it to the full 24 hours, but I sort of understand it a little bit better. I think you kind of just got to grin and bear it a little
Mm.
bit. I think you're going to be uncomfortable for 24 hours. It's not going to be the best night's sleep you're going to get. It's not going to be the best you're ever going to feel in the car, but you just got to kind of suck it up and deal with it a little bit. And I think in reflection, knowing that and going forwards, knowing that, I think that's the approach I would take.
So is this now sort of near the top of the list or at the top of the list of an ambition going forward? Is this now right? Target Le Mans 24 next year?
Absolutely. Targeting
Yeah.
next year, obviously trying to target the result now. But yeah, for sure got the bug for these kind of endurance races, 24-hour races, and it's an incredible spectacle as well. I think I'd been once before 10 years ago, but I think actually just being in and involved that weekend, it's incredible. I think racing fan or not, I'd encourage anyone to go to it because you've got 300 odd thousand spectators all going, watching this sort of festival of motorsport, which was awesome experience.
Is it good? I mean, you won't know this because you've been driving. Well, you will partly know it, but you were driving in it. Is it, at the risk of annoying motorsport fans, is it good to watch?
I think you don't go to watch every single lap. You don't. I think some people do. But I was amazed. There's so many British people that came down to the weekend that weren't, integrated in watching the live timing of every race. But you go out in the middle of the night. There's all sorts of different barbecues. In the night, it was actually challenging because you've got the smell of the barbecues and you're trying to drive and you're a bit distracted by it all. And it's a huge festival as well. I think there's a lot of people that might have looked a little bit like you when you're on your way back from the capital summertime pool. And I think you just enjoy the sport alongside it. And I think it's a great celebration of our sport, which I think
brilliant.
is a great event.
Yeah, and another one that we're going to have to take the sports agents to, Chappers,
Definitely,
next year.
definitely,
Exactly,
we could
next
do
year.
that.
I think the smell of barbecue, I mean, that's like going out for a jog on a summer's evening, isn't it? It's impossible. You're just smelling sausages and trying to keep going. It's so hard.
It was funny because one of our teammates, Andre Lotterer, has won the race in the overall top class 3 times. He's super experienced. And out of all the information he gave me, I felt like that was the most useful bit because he came in and he's like, I need to warn you, you're going to go through this section of corners of Porsche curves and you're going to smell barbecue and you're going to see smoke. Don't be put off by it. And genuinely, the first time I went through there, it was like a full shock to all my senses. My nose, my sight, everything was all a bit off.
I could stop, have a quick sausage.
If only the wheel fell off right in this moment.
Oh, Jamie, thanks so much for coming back
No problem.
and telling us.
Thank you.
We'll catch up again next time when I'm sure we'll have a full 24 hours to dissect.
Exactly. Thank you.
Right, go on then.
Minor obsession?
This is your pet subject here. Although, having said that, at the end of the French Open final, I did think the same when both men put on these rugby shirts. But you take it away.
Alcaraz and Sinner were wearing rugby shirts at the end of the French Open. They played this epic game of tennis, absolutely boiling. And then they're in these rugby shirts. And they were very nice. But I did think that doesn't seem like the kind of thing I would naturally want to pull on if I'm really, really warm and I'm in the middle of a beautiful Parisian kind of balmy evening. And then I noticed these creeping into other matches and other places. And then this week at Queen's, yet again, the rugby shirts have been out. Jack Draper is pulling his on, is donning his after his matches. He's into the quarterfinals, by the way, on Friday. And if he wins, that would be up to 4th seed for Wimbledon, so be 4th in the world, which was really good because obviously he'd then avoid any seeds above him until potentially the semi-finals.
Back to the rugby shirt.
Back to the rugby shirt. Sorry, just our boy Jack.
Is it a maroon rugby shirt?
Different colours for different strokes for different folks.
Right. No, so Sinner's was blue and green at the French Open.
Yes, it was, and Jack's is kind of burgundy, reddy kind of colour. Yeah. And I mean, their faces are often burgundy and red at the end of these matches, and then he's got a rugby shirt to match. So I kind of put this on my social media the other day, and I wouldn't bring this to the party today and to the podcast if it wasn't something that has clearly also intrigued and piqued the interest of a lot of other people watching, thinking, obviously Nike's trying to sell these rugby shirts, right? Maybe they've got a job lot somewhere and they've got to get rid of them. And they're putting them out there on the most kind of, the biggest platform they've got at the moment. But it seems like a strange thing to put a tennis player in. When you look back to the classic kind of zip-up tops of Roger Federer's days.
Well, yeah, and I haven't seen the Jack Draper one, but I did see obviously Sinner and Alcaraz put theirs on, and all I could think of with Sinner's in particular was like that sort of very 90s, early 2000s, and actually I still have a Sale Sharks rugby shirt that is like that because to younger listeners, rugby shirts used to weigh about the equivalent of a small bungalow, right? And we're not like now where they're so skin tight and you can't grab hold of them, but they were sort of proper heavy garments, and that's exactly what they look like. So I think I've definitely got a Sale one. I may have a very old England Rugby Union one as well. So I mean, I could wear one for the next pod.
Well, they have come back even into women's fashion. I've noticed them popping into various things. Yeah, it's funny how these things come around, doesn't it? Because you kind of, as you say, that doesn't feel that long ago to us, but to the kids, because you can imagine Kenny, if there's one thing he's got that impresses our children, it's a stash of rugby shirts, So Ruben wears them to go out, even though he wears them at work, which it's like wearing scrubs if you're a doctor to go for a night out. I'm like, what are you doing? And he's wearing some absolute, I have to say, cool shirts from like the 70s, not 70s, Kenny's not old, from the 90s. So for like, the Wallabies, and they've got like these amazing kind of bars ones, and these brilliant all black ones, and Ireland, tops, some great shirts. But I do find that slightly odd. That
I'm gonna dig mine out then. Maybe that's it for one of the upcoming pods.
Shall we wear one on Tuesday? In support of the very hot tennis players. Well, good luck to Jack, because as you know, he is sponsored by the podcast.
Yeah, he's unaware. He's unaware that he's sponsored by the
love
podcast.
And support. And look, if you're out there wearing a rugby shirt because you're ahead of the game fashion-wise, please get in touch on socials or via email at thesportsagents@global.com. Send your pictures. We'd love to see you.
I honestly, I cannot wait to look at photos of you in rugby shirts. That will make my morning. But you can email us, thesportsagents@global.com as well.
And remember, catch up with all episodes of The Sports Agents on Global Player or wherever you get your podcasts. Just hit subscribe or follow, and if you can, leave a review.
Thanks for listening.
The Sports Agents
with Gabby Logan and Mark Chapman.